There is a specific kind of pain that doesn't shout. It whispers. It shows up late at night, when everything is quiet, and suddenly your mind replays one moment you wish you could erase. A choice you made, a word you said, a door you didn't walk through, and no matter how much time passes, it feels like that moment is still alive inside you, asking the same question over and over. What if? Most people think regret fades with time, but it doesn't. It fades only when it's understood. Stoicism doesn't tell you to forget the past or pretend it didn't hurt. It shows you how to stop letting that moment control who you become next. Regret becomes unbearable when your mind keeps trying to change something that no longer exists. The Stoics noticed this thousands of years ago. They understood that suffering isn't caused by the event itself, but by the endless argument you keep having with reality. You replay conversations hoping they'll end differently. You imagine alternate versions of your life, as if thinking hard enough might bend time backward. But the past is not a problem to be solved. It's a fact to be accepted. Once you truly accept that a moment is over, your energy stops leaking into mental loops and becomes available for growth. One of the most powerful Stoic ideas is the distinction between what is in your control and what is not. Your past decisions are not in your control anymore. They are fixed, untouchable. But your interpretation of them is still completely yours. Regret convinces you that a mistake defines you. Stoicism says a mistake is simply information, data about who you were at the time, not a verdict on who you must remain. When you stop treating the past like a courtroom and start treating it like a classroom, regret loses its grip. Most people punish themselves for past mistakes because they believe pain equals accountability. They think if they suffer enough, it somehow balances the scales. But the Stoics rejected this idea entirely. Self-punishment doesn't correct the past. It only weakens the present. Growth requires clarity, not shame. If regret hasn't changed your behavior, then it isn't teaching you anything. It's just draining you. Stoicism asks a simple question instead. What did this experience train me to see that I couldn't see before? That question transforms regret from a wound into a tool. Another reason regret feels so heavy is because the mind confuses intention with outcome. You judge your past self using knowledge you only gained later. That's unfair. You didn't make choices with today's wisdom. You made them with the information, emotional capacity, and awareness you had at that moment. Stoicism teaches compassion toward your former self, not indulgence, but realism. You were acting as a human, not a machine. Once you understand this, regret stops feeling like evidence of failure and starts feeling like proof of growth. The Stoics also believed that every experience, especially painful ones, could be repurposed. They used the phrase, turning obstacles into fuel. Regret is energy, intense, emotional energy. Left unmanaged, it turns into anxiety, bitterness, or self-hatred. Directed properly, it becomes discipline, humility, and wisdom. The same memory that once kept you awake can become the reason you make better choices today. Not because you're afraid, but because you're awake. What keeps people stuck is the belief that moving on means minimizing what happened. Stoicism never asks you to minimize pain. It asks you to stop worshipping it. There is a difference between honoring a lesson and building an identity around a mistake. You can acknowledge the damage without living inside it. The moment you stop saying, "This ruined me," and start saying, "This refined me," your relationship with the past changes completely. Stoicism also teaches voluntary discomfort, the idea that growth comes from facing what you avoid. Instead of running from regret, you calmly sit with it and examine it. What exactly do you regret? The outcome, or the version of yourself you were back then? What belief did that mistake shatter? What illusion did it expose? When regret is examined honestly, it often reveals the values you didn't know you had yet. That awareness becomes a compass, not a curse. Many people secretly fear letting go of regret because it feels like losing a connection to what mattered. But regret doesn't honor the past. It freezes it. Growth honors the past by proving it wasn't wasted. The Stoics believed life was happening for you, not to you, even when it didn't feel that way. Once you adopt that perspective, regret stops asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and starts asking, "How can this shape me?" Over time, Stoicism trains you to see your life as a long arc rather than a single moment. No one chapter defines the entire book. A mistake only becomes permanent if you stop writing after it. The past doesn't demand your suffering. It demands your understanding. And when you finally give it that, regret loses its power to haunt you and gains a new role, guiding you forward with quiet strength. One of the most practical Stoic habits for dissolving regret was nightly reflection. At the end of each day, they would sit quietly and review their actions without drama, not to attack themselves, but to observe. They would ask simple questions. What did I do well? Where did I fall short? What will I improve tomorrow? This practice prevented small mistakes from turning into lifelong regret. Instead of letting guilt pile up for years, they processed it daily. When you examine your behavior regularly, you correct your path quickly. Regret grows in silence and avoidance. Reflection shrinks it through awareness. Another powerful practice was something we would call view from above. The Stoics would mentally zoom out and imagine looking at their life from a higher perspective, almost like watching themselves from the sky. From that distance, the mistake that feels massive begins to shrink. Your embarrassment, your bad decision, your missed opportunity, when placed in the context of your entire life and then humanity as a whole, becomes smaller. Not meaningless, but manageable. This mental shift breaks the illusion that one moment defines everything. It reminds you that you are part of a much larger story still unfolding. The Stoics also practiced negative visualization, which sounds dark, but is actually freeing. They would imagine losing what they currently had: relationships, health, opportunities. Why? Because it trained gratitude and perspective. When you practice appreciating what remains, instead of obsessing over what was lost, regret loses its emotional charge. You begin to see that even after a mistake, you still have time, breath, and the ability to act differently. Gratitude doesn't erase regret, but it weakens its dominance over your mind. Another daily discipline was controlling inner dialogue. Stoics understood that the voice in your head can either train you or torment you. When regret appears, most people say, "I'm so stupid," or "I always mess things up." That language becomes identity. Stoicism replaces that with correction instead of condemnation. The internal shift is subtle but powerful. That action was unwise instead of "I am unworthy." By separating behavior from identity, you keep your dignity intact while still taking responsibility. This is how you grow without breaking yourself. They also practiced voluntary ownership. Instead of blaming circumstances or other people, they would calmly say, "This was my choice," not in a harsh way, but in an empowering way. Ownership removes victimhood, and once you stop being a victim of your past, you regain control over your future. Regret feels suffocating when you believe life happened to you. It becomes liberating when you realize you still have agency moving forward. Another key practice was focusing on present action. Stoicism is deeply action-oriented. It doesn't allow you to sit in emotional loops. The question always returns to, what is the next right thing to do? Not next year, not in theory. Today, regret dissolves when it is replaced by deliberate action. If you hurt someone, the next right action may be to apologize sincerely. If you failed at something, the next right action may be to learn the skill you avoided. Action converts emotional energy into progress. Without action, regret multiplies. The Stoics also trained emotional endurance. They did not run from discomfort. They allowed themselves to feel the sting of a mistake fully, but without exaggerating it. When you stop labeling discomfort as unbearable, it becomes survivable. Regret often feels overwhelming because you resist the feeling itself. When you allow the feeling to exist without fighting it, it passes faster. Emotional resistance prolongs pain. Acceptance shortens it. Another overlooked Stoic habit was premeditation of future challenges. Each morning, they would remind themselves that mistakes are part of being human. They expected imperfection. This mindset reduces shock when you fall short. If you expect yourself to be flawless, every mistake becomes a catastrophe. If you expect to learn, mistakes become part of the training process. Regret softens when perfection is no longer the standard. They also believed strongly in aligning with virtue over outcome. Virtue meant acting with wisdom, courage, justice, and self-control. Outcomes are unpredictable. You can make the best decision available and still face a negative result. Regret often attaches itself to outcomes you couldn't fully control. But if your intention was aligned with virtue at the time, then the outcome does not invalidate your character. Focusing on character instead of results prevents unnecessary self-blame. And perhaps most powerful of all, the Stoics practiced beginning again, every single day. They did not allow yesterday's mistake to cancel today's effort. They understood that identity is shaped by repeated actions over time, not by one failure. When you wake up and deliberately choose to act differently, you are rewriting your story in real time. Regret loses its power the moment you prove to yourself that growth is happening now. These practices were not dramatic. They were simple, repeated daily. Reflection, perspective, gratitude, ownership, action, emotional discipline, virtue, beginning again. When done consistently, regret doesn't disappear overnight, but it transforms. It shifts from a haunting memory into a quiet reminder of how far you've come. There is another layer to regret that the Stoics understood deeply. Regret is often tied to ego, not just guilt, but wounded pride. Many times what keeps you stuck is not the mistake itself, but the fact that it shattered the image you had of yourself. You believed you were wiser, kinder, stronger, more disciplined, and then you acted in a way that contradicted that belief. The pain is not only about what happened, it's about the identity collapse that followed. Stoicism teaches you to detach from ego-based identity and anchor yourself in continuous improvement instead. You are not the image you tried to protect. You are the effort you make to refine yourself daily. When ego softens, regret loses much of its emotional weight. The Stoics also recognized that regret becomes toxic when it turns into rumination. Rumination feels productive because you are thinking intensely, but it produces nothing. It is mental motion without forward movement. The Stoics trained themselves to interrupt this loop. The moment they noticed repetitive, unproductive thinking, they would redirect their focus to something actionable or meaningful. This wasn't avoidance, it was discipline. They understood that attention is a limited resource. If you spend it reliving what cannot change, you weaken your ability to shape what can. Mastering attention is one of the most practical ways to dissolve regret. Another deeper practice involves reframing the role of pain itself. Most people see regret as punishment. Stoicism reframes it as instruction. Pain signals misalignment. It tells you that your behavior and your values were not in harmony. Instead of suppressing regret, the Stoics would extract the principle beneath it. If you regret lying, then truth matters to you. If you regret neglecting someone, then connection matters to you. The regret reveals your deeper values. Once you see that, the pain becomes directional rather than destructive. It points you toward who you want to become. The Stoics also understood impermanence in a way that many people resist. Everything changes, circumstances change, people change, you change. The version of you that made the mistake no longer exists in the same form, yet regret tries to freeze you in that moment forever. When you deeply internalize impermanence, you realize you are not obligated to carry an outdated version of yourself into the future. Growth is not betrayal of your past, it is evolution. Regret weakens when you allow yourself to outgrow the person you once were. There is also the Stoic emphasis on character over reputation. Many regrets are tied to how others see us. You replay the mistake not just because of what happened, but because of how it made you look. Stoicism asks you to shift your focus inward. The only reputation that truly matters is the one you hold with yourself. If you have learned, corrected, and improved, then external judgment loses its authority. You cannot control other people's memory of your mistake, but you can control your commitment to becoming better. That internal alignment restores stability. Another deeper practice involves accepting that life includes loss and error by design. The Stoics did not believe in a life free of hardship. They believed adversity was part of human training. When you adopt this mindset, regret no longer feels like proof that you failed at life. It feels like proof that you are participating in it. Every skilled person carries stories of poor decisions and wrong turns. The difference is not in avoiding mistakes, it is in how quickly and honestly you integrate them into wisdom. The Stoics also warned against attaching your peace to outcomes that were never fully yours to control. Sometimes regret comes from decisions that had unpredictable consequences. You made the best choice you could at the time, yet the result was painful. Stoicism teaches that you control effort and intention, not results. If your effort was sincere and your intention aligned with your best understanding, then the outcome does not define your worth. Learning this reduces unnecessary self-attack and replaces it with balanced self-evaluation. Another powerful layer is understanding time correctly. Regret traps you in the illusion that you lost your only chance. The Stoics rejected this scarcity mindset. As long as you are alive, you have the ability to act differently. Maybe not in the same way, maybe not with the same person, maybe not in the same circumstance, but the opportunity for virtue always exists. Regret says, it's too late. Stoicism says, it's too late for that moment, but not for growth. That distinction keeps hope grounded in realism rather than fantasy. There is also courage involved in letting regret go. Many people cling to it because it feels familiar. They build a quiet identity around being the one who messed up. Letting go requires stepping into responsibility without self-pity. It requires trusting that you can handle yourself moving forward. Stoicism builds this trust through small, consistent acts of integrity. Every time you choose the better action today, you rebuild confidence. Over time, your present behavior speaks louder than your past mistake. Finally, the deepest Stoic transformation happens when you stop asking how to erase regret and start asking how to honor it. Not by suffering endlessly, but by living in a way that proves the lesson was integrated. The memory remains, but its emotional charge shifts. It becomes a quiet checkpoint in your development. It reminds you how far you've come, how much stronger you've become, and how capable you are of growth. And in that shift, regret is no longer a haunting presence. It becomes evidence that you are evolving. At an even deeper level, the Stoics understood that regret often survives because people secretly believe they deserve to suffer for what they did. This belief feels moral on the surface, but it quietly keeps you trapped. Stoicism separates responsibility from self-destruction. Taking responsibility means correcting your course and acting with integrity now. Self-destruction does nothing except keep you weak. The Stoics believed strength, not suffering, was the proper response to past errors. When you release the need to punish yourself, you free up energy to become disciplined, present, and grounded. Another subtle practice was training indifference toward unproductive emotions. This does not mean becoming cold or numb. It means refusing to let emotions hijack your reason. When regret appears, the Stoic response is not to argue with it emotionally, but to observe it rationally. This feeling is here. It will pass. I will not let it dictate my actions. That calm, internal stance prevents emotional spirals. Regret weakens when it no longer controls your behavior. The Stoics also emphasized self-command through routine. Regret thrives in chaotic, unstructured minds. Daily routines, waking at a consistent time, physical movement, mental reflection, disciplined work, create internal order. When your life has structure, regret has less room to dominate. You stop drifting backward mentally because your days are anchored forward. Structure doesn't erase memory, but it stabilizes your mind enough to move through it without collapse. Another deeper layer involves forgiveness, not in a sentimental way, but in a practical one. Stoic forgiveness begins with understanding causation. You acted based on conditioning, emotion, ignorance, or fear. That does not excuse harm, but it explains it. When you understand why you acted the way you did, you gain power over future behavior. Forgiveness in Stoicism is not about absolution, it's about clarity. And clarity is what dissolves regret. The Stoics were also strict about avoiding identity fusion with emotion. You are not your regret. You are the awareness experiencing it. This distinction sounds small, but it is transformative. When you say, I am regretful, the emotion owns you. When you say, I am experiencing regret, you create space. In that space, choice reappears. Stoicism is less about controlling emotions and more about not being consumed by them. They also believed that meaning is created, not discovered. Your past mistake has no built-in meaning. You assign meaning to it through interpretation. You can frame it as a permanent stain or as a turning point. Stoicism insists that meaning is an act of will. When you consciously decide what the experience means, regret loses its randomness and becomes purposeful. Purpose transforms pain into fuel. Another practice was exposure to mortality. The Stoics reflected often on death, not to become morbid, but to sharpen perspective. When you remember that life is finite, regret loses its drama. You realize how limited your time and attention truly are. Wasting years mentally reliving one mistake becomes irrational. Mortality awareness redirects you toward living well now, instead of endlessly revisiting what cannot be changed. They also trained themselves to accept emotional discomfort without story. Most suffering comes not from the feeling itself, but from the narrative attached to it. This means, I failed. This means I'm behind. This means I ruined everything. Stoicism strips regret of story and leaves only sensation, and sensation alone is far easier to tolerate. When you stop adding meaning, regret becomes a passing experience rather than a permanent identity. Over time, consistent Stoic practice creates emotional resilience. You stop expecting life to be painless, and you stop interpreting pain as a personal attack. Regret still arises, but it no longer destabilizes you. It becomes a signal, not a sentence. And when regret is treated as information rather than condemnation, it naturally fades, because its lesson has been learned. Each time you meet regret with calm understanding instead of panic or shame, you retrain your nervous system. You prove to yourself that you can feel discomfort without collapsing. This is real strength. And eventually, the memory that once haunted you becomes neutral. It's still part of your story, but it no longer controls the direction of your life. One of the deepest shifts Stoicism creates is teaching you to stop negotiating with the past. Regret keeps you stuck in invisible bargaining. If only I had done this, then everything would be different. The Stoics saw this as wasted mental effort because it places your focus on an alternate reality that will never exist. They trained themselves to meet reality exactly as it is, without resistance. When you stop negotiating with the past, you reclaim the present, and the present is the only place where power exists. The Stoics also understood that regret is often tied to fear of repeating the same mistake. Your mind keeps replaying the memory as a warning system, but when left unmanaged, that warning turns into paralysis. Stoicism reframes this by transforming fear into preparedness. Instead of saying, "I can't afford to mess up again," you learn to say, "I am more aware now." Awareness is strength. Once the lesson is integrated, the mind no longer needs to replay the event. The repetition stops because the danger has been understood. Another subtle practice was learning to live without emotional debt. Many people carry regret as if they owe the past something, an explanation, suffering, or constant remembrance. Stoicism rejects this idea. The past does not demand payment. It only offers instruction. When you stop treating regret like a debt and start treating it like a completed lesson, your mind releases its grip. You do not dishonor the past by moving forward. You fulfill it. The Stoics also trained themselves to act in alignment even when motivation was absent. Regret often kills motivation. You feel unworthy of progress. Stoicism doesn't wait for motivation. It prioritizes discipline. You act because it is right, not because you feel inspired. This breaks the emotional stagnation regret creates. Each aligned action rebuilds self-respect, and self-respect is the antidote to lingering regret. Another layer involves how Stoics viewed time. They didn't see the past as something behind them and the future as something ahead. They saw life as a series of moments calling for virtue. When regret pulls you backward, Stoicism anchors you in the moment that is asking for your response right now. You are not late to your life. You are exactly where you are, with the tools you have. That realization restores momentum. The Stoics also practiced intentional silence. They limited unnecessary talk, especially about their own mistakes. Constantly retelling your regret keeps it alive. Stoicism encourages you to let lessons be internal rather than performative. Growth doesn't need an audience. When you stop narrating your past pain, it loses its emotional charge and becomes private wisdom instead of public identity. They were also careful about comparison. Regret often intensifies when you compare your timeline to others. Stoicism rejects comparison entirely because it places your peace in external hands. Everyone moves through different conditions, advantages, and obstacles. Your path is yours. When you stop measuring your life against someone else's outcomes, regret loses its reference point and weakens. Another Stoic practice was voluntary humility. This meant accepting that error is part of being human. Not dramatic humility, but quiet acceptance. You were not meant to get everything right. When you accept this fully, regret stops feeling like evidence of failure and starts feeling like evidence of humanity. This removes shame, which is the fuel regret runs on. The Stoics also believed in practicing patience with personal evolution. They understood that change is gradual. Expecting instant transformation only creates more regret when you stumble again. Stoicism allows for progress without perfection. Each small improvement counts. When you track growth instead of fixating on failure, regret fades into the background. At its deepest level, Stoicism teaches trust. Trust in your ability to respond well to life moving forward. Regret exists because you doubt yourself. Stoic practice rebuilds self-trust through consistent, principled action. And once trust is restored, regret has no job left to do. It came to warn you. It taught you. Now it can leave. When the lesson is integrated, the memory remains, but the suffering does not. At a certain point, Stoicism asks you to confront an uncomfortable truth. Regret survives because part of you is still attached to who you could have been. You mourn a version of yourself that exists only in imagination. That imagined life becomes a silent standard you keep measuring yourself against. The Stoics saw this as a trap. They taught that peace does not come from chasing hypothetical versions of yourself, but from fully inhabiting the person you are becoming now. When you release the fantasy of the unlived life, you stop fighting shadows and start shaping reality. The Stoics also understood that memory itself is neutral. It is your judgment that turns it into suffering. The same memory can either teach or torment, depending on how it is framed. When regret arises, Stoicism trains you to say, "This memory has returned. What is it asking me to remember?" Often, it's not asking you to suffer again. It's reminding you of a boundary you crossed, a value you clarified, or a strength you hadn't yet developed. When memory becomes guidance instead of accusation, it no longer feels hostile. Another deep practice involves accepting irreversibility. One of the hardest things for the human mind to accept is that some things cannot be undone. Stoicism does not soften this truth. It strengthens you to face it. Once you accept that reversal is impossible, the mind stops wasting energy trying to reverse it. That energy returns to the present, where change is still possible. Irreversibility feels cruel at first, but it is also freeing. It closes one door so you can finally walk through another. The Stoics also trained themselves to live without emotional dramatization. Regret grows louder when it is dramatized, narrated, and emotionally embellished. Stoicism strips the drama away. It brings regret back to facts. This happened, this was learned, this is what will change. When you stop inflating the emotional story, regret becomes quieter and shorter-lived. Drama keeps pain alive. Simplicity dissolves it. There is also the Stoic emphasis on consistency over intensity. Many people respond to regret with emotional promises, big declarations of change that fade quickly. The Stoics distrusted emotional surges. They believed real transformation happens through small, repeated acts of discipline. One better choice today, one moment of restraint, one honest conversation. Over time, these small acts outweigh the past mistake. Regret fades, not because you decided to let it go, but because your life no longer reflects it. The Stoics also warned against confusing guilt with morality. Feeling bad does not make you good. Acting well does. Regret can create a false sense of moral progress. At least I feel terrible about it. Stoicism rejects that comfort. It asks for behavior, not emotion. When your actions begin to align with your values, guilt loses its purpose and naturally fades. Another deep insight is that regret often masks fear of judgment, by others or by yourself. Stoicism teaches you to become your own fair judge, neither cruel nor lenient, honest. When you judge yourself fairly, you stop swinging between self-hate and self-excuse. That balance brings stability. Regret weakens when it is met with justice rather than punishment. The Stoics also practiced reducing unnecessary desire. Regret often comes from wanting things to have been different, wanting approval, success, love, recognition. Stoicism teaches that the more you need external outcomes to validate you, the more regret you create when they don't happen. By simplifying desires and focusing on inner character, you reduce the surface area where regret can attach. There is also a quiet courage required to live forward-facing. Regret constantly pulls your attention backward. Stoicism trains you to stand facing life, even when you feel exposed. Forward-facing living requires trust in your ability to handle whatever comes next. Each day you live this way, regret loses relevance. It belongs to a direction you no longer face. Eventually, Stoic practice leads you to a simple realization. Regret is not an enemy. It is a messenger that stays only as long as it is ignored. At this stage of the journey, Stoicism begins working less like a technique and more like a quiet internal shift. Regret no longer feels like an enemy you need to defeat. It feels like a signal that has already delivered its message. The Stoics believed that once a lesson is learned, continued suffering is unnecessary. Holding on to regret after growth has occurred is like rereading a warning sign long after you've changed direction. The mind eventually learns to let go when it realizes there is nothing left to extract. Another deep realization the Stoics had was that regret often survives because people confuse memory with obligation. Just because you remember something does not mean you are required to relive it emotionally. Memory is neutral. Emotion is optional. Stoicism trains you to allow memories to exist without attaching pain to them. Over time, the same event that once caused a physical tightening in your chest becomes just another recalled moment. Informational, distant, calm. This is not repression, it is mastery. The Stoics also placed great emphasis on self-respect as a daily practice. Not confidence, not pride, self-respect. And self-respect is rebuilt through behavior, not thought. Each time you act in a way that aligns with your values, especially after regret, you quietly repair your relationship with yourself. Regret weakens self-respect because it convinces you that you are unreliable. Consistent, virtuous action proves otherwise. Eventually, your present behavior becomes more convincing than your past mistake. There is also a powerful Stoic idea that regret is often future-focused without realizing it. You fear that the past mistake predicts future failure. Stoicism dismantles this belief by separating past behavior from future capacity. Capacity grows, awareness grows, skill grows. The past is not a prophecy. It is a reference point. When you truly understand this, regret loses its predictive power and becomes historically contained. Another subtle practice involves choosing usefulness over self-judgment. The Stoics constantly ask themselves, is this thought useful? If a thought did not improve character or guide action, it was discarded. Regret often fails this test. Once the lesson is learned, replaying the memory adds nothing. When you adopt usefulness as your internal filter, regret naturally fades because it no longer earns your attention. The Stoics also believed that inner peace comes from alignment, not perfection. Alignment means your actions match your values today, not that your past was flawless. When alignment becomes your standard, regret no longer threatens your identity. You may acknowledge that you once acted out of fear, ignorance, or impulse, but you also recognize that you are no longer acting that way now. That recognition stabilizes the mind. Another deeper truth Stoicism reveals is that growth often requires symbolic endings. Sometimes regret lingers because you have not mentally closed a chapter. The Stoics practiced intentional closure by consciously affirming, that version of me is complete. This does not erase the past, it places it where it belongs. When a chapter is closed, the mind stops flipping back to it. They also understood that peace is not achieved by erasing pain, but by expanding your capacity to hold it without collapse. Regret feels overwhelming only when your nervous system lacks trust in your ability to endure discomfort. Stoic practice slowly builds that trust. You learn that you can feel regret, sadness, or disappointment, and still function, still choose well, still move forward. That realization alone weakens regret's grip. Over time, Stoicism trains you to live forward-facing, not recklessly, not dismissively, but intentionally. You stop asking, how do I undo the past? And start asking, how do I live in a way that honors what I've learned? That shift changes everything. Regret no longer pulls you backward, it quietly pushes you forward. Eventually, the past mistake becomes something you carry lightly, not as a burden, but as proof of transformation. And in that state, regret has fulfilled its purpose and dissolves on its own, leaving behind clarity, steadiness, and growth. If this message is resonating with you, understand that awareness itself is already a form of growth. The Stoics believed that once you see a pattern clearly, you are no longer trapped inside it. You are standing above it. Regret loses power the moment it becomes conscious. And right now, if you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in these words, That means you're already moving forward, whether you realize it or not. If this perspective is helping you loosen the grip of the past, take a moment to support the growth you're creating. Like this video, so this message reaches others who may be silently struggling with regret. Subscribe to PSYCHOVEST if you want more content rooted in Stoic wisdom, emotional discipline, and real personal transformation. And share this with someone who keeps blaming themselves for a moment they can't change, but doesn't know how to move on yet. Growth doesn't require perfection. It requires repetition. The more often you expose your mind to ideas that strengthen clarity and self-command, the less power old regrets will have over you. Every time you choose reflection over rumination, action over shame, and understanding over self-attack, you are practicing Stoicism in real time. Stay committed to that practice, and you'll notice something subtle but profound. The past will stop calling so loudly, and the present will finally feel like home. After the call to action, it's important to ground the listener back into the lived experience of change, because Stoicism was never meant to stay in theory. The Stoics believed that understanding without embodiment is incomplete. You don't transform regret by agreeing with ideas. You transform it by noticing how differently you respond the next time the memory surfaces. When that familiar wave of regret rises and you don't panic, don't spiral, don't punish yourself. That moment matters more than any insight. That is where philosophy becomes real. That is where growth actually shows up. At this point, many people notice something unexpected. Regret doesn't vanish all at once. It fades in layers. Some days, it barely whispers. Other days, it returns with force. Stoicism prepares you for this, so you don't interpret its return as failure. The Stoics understood progress as uneven but directional. Just because an old feeling reappears does not mean you've gone backward. It often means your mind is testing a new response. Each time you meet regret with calm instead of self-attack, you weaken the old habit and strengthen the new one. There is also a deeper freedom that comes when you stop using regret as motivation. Many people fear that without regret, they will become careless or repeat mistakes. Stoicism replaces fear-based motivation with value-based action. You don't act well because you're haunted. You act well because you respect yourself. This shift is subtle but life-changing. When your behavior is driven by values instead of fear, it becomes sustainable. Regret loses its role as an enforcer because discipline now comes from inner alignment rather than emotional pain. Another important Stoic realization is that growth often feels quieter than suffering. Regret is loud. It demands attention. Growth is subtle. It shows up as better boundaries, calmer reactions, wiser pauses. Many people mistakenly believe nothing is changing because there is no emotional drama anymore. But that calm is evidence of integration. The Stoics trusted quiet progress more than intense emotion. When regret no longer shakes you, it means it no longer owns you. The Stoics also believed that wisdom deepens when you stop rehearsing the story and start living the lesson. You don't need to remind yourself daily of what went wrong if your current behavior already reflects what you learned. At that point, revisiting the past becomes redundant. The mind naturally releases what is no longer necessary. Regret dissolves not because you force it away, but because it no longer serves a purpose. Another layer that emerges is forgiveness toward life itself, not just yourself, but the unpredictability of existence. Stoicism teaches that life will always include uncertainty, missed chances, and imperfect timing. When you stop expecting life to be clean and fair, regret loses its shock value. You begin to see mistakes not as interruptions to your path, but as part of it. This acceptance creates emotional stability that regret cannot easily disturb. Over time, the memory that once felt heavy becomes oddly neutral. You can think about it without tension. You can mention it without shame. You can even use it to help others without reopening the wound. This is one of the clearest signs that Stoic integration has occurred. The experience no longer defines you, it informs you. And that distinction changes everything. Eventually, regret stops being something you manage and becomes something you barely notice. Not because it disappeared, but because your life grew larger than it. Your focus shifts toward character, action, and presence. You stop measuring yourself against a moment that no longer reflects who you are. And without effort, the past finally takes its proper place, behind you, not dragging you, not haunting you, just quietly existing as part of a story that continues forward. As this way of thinking settles in, something else begins to change quietly in the background. Your relationship with time. Regret thrives when time feels scarce, when it feels like you're behind, late, or permanently off track. Stoicism dissolves this illusion by grounding you in the reality that life is not a race with checkpoints you've missed forever. It is a sequence of moments asking for presence and character. When you fully absorb that truth, the urgency inside regret softens. You stop trying to catch up to a version of life that only exists in your imagination. Another subtle but powerful shift happens in how you relate to memory itself. The Stoics did not try to erase memories, but they trained themselves not to live inside them. Memory becomes a reference, not a residence. You can visit it briefly, extract what's useful, and leave. When regret no longer pulls you into emotional replay, it loses the ability to hijack your mood, your focus, and your decisions. You begin to experience mental space again, space to think clearly, to act deliberately, to breathe without heaviness. At this stage, many people notice a growing sense of inner authority. Regret once acted like a judge, constantly reminding you of your past failures. Stoicism quietly removes that judge and replaces it with a guide. Instead of asking, "What does this say about me?" you ask, "What does this ask of me now?" That shift restores dignity. You are no longer on trial, you are in training, and training implies forward motion, not punishment. You also begin to trust yourself again, which is one of the deepest repairs Stoicism offers. Regret fractures self-trust. It convinces you that your judgment is flawed and that you cannot rely on yourself. Stoic practice rebuilds that trust through evidence, small, repeated choices that align with your values. Over time, these choices accumulate into confidence that is quiet but solid. And once self-trust returns, regret loses its leverage. Another important realization emerges here. Peace does not come from getting closure on the past. It comes from committing to the present. Many people chase closure endlessly, believing one more conversation, one more explanation, or one more apology will finally free them. Stoicism teaches that closure is an internal decision, not an external event. You close a chapter by how you live now, not by how perfectly you understand what happened then. As you continue practicing this mindset, regret stops being something you deal with and becomes something you've outgrown. The emotional charge drains away not because you forced it, but because your life has changed shape. Your attention is no longer anchored backward. Your identity is no longer tied to a single decision. You are defined by how you show up now, how you think now, how you act now. And perhaps the most liberating realization of all begins to surface. Nothing meaningful was actually lost. The mistake didn't steal your future. It redirected it. It refined your values, sharpened your awareness, and deepened your understanding of yourself and others. What once felt like damage reveals itself as depth. What once felt like failure reveals itself as formation. At that point, regret no longer feels like a shadow following you. It feels like a marker on the road you've already passed. You don't need to keep looking back at it to know where you've been. You know, because who you are now is the evidence. Regret, when seen through the Stoic lens, was never meant to be a life sentence. It was meant to be a signal, a moment of friction between who you were and who you were becoming. Once that signal has been understood, there is no wisdom in continuing to suffer. The Stoics believed that clinging to regret after growth has occurred is not humility, but misunderstanding. Growth completes the lesson. Suffering beyond that only keeps you anchored to a version of yourself that no longer exists. When you stop fighting the past and stop demanding that it be different, something inside you relaxes. The mind no longer wastes energy replaying what cannot be changed. That energy returns to the present, where your real influence lives. You realize that the past did not ruin you, it refined you. It stripped away illusions, exposed what mattered, and forced you to confront yourself honestly. That confrontation, while painful, was not destructive. It was formative. Stoicism does not promise a life free from mistakes. It offers something far more realistic and far more powerful: the ability to meet mistakes without collapse, to learn without self-hatred, and to move forward without dragging the past behind you. Regret loses its grip, not when you forget what happened, but when you become someone who no longer needs to be defined by it. In the end, the question is no longer, how do I undo my past? The Stoic answer is quieter and stronger. You don't undo it, you outgrow it. And when you do, the memory remains, but the suffering does not.